I had to talk a lot about elections and food checks this week, but still we have to talk about something else. Because according to British plan, migrants who enter the UK legally will now be deported to Rwanda. And the first people were arrested in nationwide operations already. And according to the Home Office, the first migrants destined for deportation to Rwanda have been arrested by police in Great Britain. The first illegal migrants to be deported to Rwanda have now been arrested, is what the Home Office said last Wednesday. The ministry called the step a further milestone in the British plan to deport irregular migrants to the East African country in the future. The Interior Ministry further explained that a series of nationwide operations are underway, and it published photographs and video footage of people being taken away in handcuffs and placed in vehicles. And Home Secretary James Cleverly said his house was working to quickly arrest those people who have no right to be here so we can get the flights taking off. In the future, people who entered the country irregularly should be able to be deported to Rwanda regardless of their origin and without having their asylum application examined. The East African country was classified as a safe third country by law. And according to the government's plans, a total of 5,700 migrants are to be exported to Rwanda by the end of the year. According to the new model, asylum applications will now be examined by the Rwandan government in Kigali. If they are accepted, the refugees will be granted residency rights in the East African country and will not be able to return to Great Britain. According to the government's wishes, the deportations should begin by July. The British government hopes that the deportations will have a deterrent effect on migrants. According to official statistics, more than 57,000 people arrived in the UK in small boats across the English Channel between January 22 and June 23. And in the first 4 months of this year, more than 7,200 people came into the country this way, which is a new record. And meanwhile, last Monday, according to consistent media reports, a rejected asylum seeker left Great Britain for Rwanda for the first time as part of a voluntary return program. In London, activists protested against the arrest of migrants for subsequent deportation to Rwanda. Dozens of demonstrators tried to block a bus last week Thursday that they said was taking asylum seekers from accommodation in the southeast of the capital to England's south coast. Activists also organized protests in other cities across the country against the government's announced arrests of migrants. At least 45 people have been arrested during the protests against the removal of migrants from a hotel in London. And Sky News also reported about this last week Thursday, so there were pictures. Authorities reportedly wanted to move 7 people to a multi-story residential ship anchored off the southern English coast, where the British government plans to accommodate hundreds of asylum seekers. Because of the blockade by activists, the bus finally left empty. The migrants were cared for at the headquarters of an asylum protection organization, and Home Secretary James Cleverly sharply criticized the demonstrators. The Conservative government is taking increasingly tough action against irregular migrants, and according to commentators, they are hoping that this will boost their miserable poll numbers ahead of the general election, which is scheduled to take place at some time this year. The plan includes deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda, as I said, regardless of their origin, if they entered the country without documents. The project is also causing dissatisfaction in the government apparatus. The FDA union, which represents public service employees, wants to have the requirement that civil servants follow the instructions of ministers, even if these violate international agreements on asylum law, for example, legally examined. In order to avoid deportation to Africa, refugees from Great Britain travel on to Ireland now, and Brexit prevents a common solution here. Last week, Wednesday morning, the Irish government's patience was over. The police cleared a tent city that refugees had set up in front of the immigration office in downtown Dublin, and around 300 new arrivals camped on the street because the Irish authorities could no longer offer them permanent accommodation. Numerous refugees who initially entered Great Britain by boat across the English Channel moved on to the Republic of Ireland via Northern Ireland and applied for asylum there. Since the British government pushed through its plan in Parliament to deport all illegally entered refugees to the East African country of Rwanda, more of them have been coming. The prospect of being flown to Rwanda appears to have persuaded many asylum seekers to travel on to Ireland to avoid deportation by the British authorities. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has announced the first deportation flights for July, as I said. The problem with Great Britain is that they could send us to Rwanda, is how the London daily The Times quoted a refugee from Jordan in Dublin as saying. And now Ireland and Great Britain are arguing over how to deal with asylum seekers. The increase in migration has caused a frenzy in Dublin and led to diplomatic tensions with London. Ireland is not a loophole, said the new Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach Simon Harris. He will not accept that the migration problems of other countries are thwarting Dublin's asylum policy. The extent of this secondary migration is unclear, as the government in Dublin does not provide exact figures yet. But according to the Irish Times, only a good 400 people applied for asylum at the border crossings in ports and airports this year. Around 5,000 applications were received directly at the Migration Authority's office in downtown Dublin. Based on these figures, the Irish Minister of Justice came to the conclusion that around 80% of asylum seekers this year came from Northern Ireland via the open land border. There has been freedom of movement and freedom of establishment between Ireland and Great Britain since 1923, within the framework of the Common Travel Area. Brexit hasn't changed anything about that. In order to stop migration, Ireland wants to send asylum seekers back to Great Britain. However, the Irish High Court stopped all returns to the United Kingdom in March because the country could no longer be considered a safe third country due to the Rwanda Pact, which is hilarious. The agreement has drawn criticism from human rights groups, and the British Supreme Court rejected an earlier version of the plan last winter as violating international law and British law. And the Irish cabinet has now passed an urgent law that should make returns to Great Britain possible again. So Prime Minister Taoiseach Harris said he expects the UK to fulfill its commitments to readmit migrants under a bilateral agreement concluded in the wake of Brexit. From the British perspective, however, this is just a technical agreement with no legal binding force. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said he was not considering allowing migrants from Ireland back into the country. This is especially true since the EU country France also refuses to take back asylum seekers who have reached England via the English Channel. According to Sunak, Ireland's complaints show that its Rwanda Pact is already having a deterrent effect. The excitement also has a political reason. In Ireland, the high numbers of migrants and refugees have become a hot topic in recent months. Taoiseach Harris, who has only been in office for a few weeks, wants to make a name for himself in order to save his centre-right Fine Gael party from an election defeat in the spring of 2025. Harris seems to welcome the impression that the old colonial power Great Britain is exacerbating Irish migration problems. Sunak, meanwhile, has promised to stop migration across the English Channel. Given the catastrophic poll number of his Conservative Party, he urgently needs success with a view to the upcoming general election. The local elections were a catastrophe as well. The dispute is also an echo of the Brexit dispute between London and Dublin. The Irish government had always insisted that the land border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland remains open to freight traffic. And now former Brexit chief negotiator David Frost accused Ireland of cherry picking, which is hilarious too. Unlike goods and customs checks, personal checks were never discussed in the Brexit negotiations. Meanwhile, the British government is working hard to implement its Rwanda plan. The Home Office has identified around 5,700 asylum seekers who are eligible for deportation to Rwanda, but had to admit that a significant number of them could have gone into hiding. The government will soon take the first asylum seekers into custody in new centers for deportation, and according to the government's timetable, the first flights to Rwanda should take off in July, as I said, at the latest, after the appeals have been processed. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.